Sony just released a major firmware update for their a7S III and some other cameras, and in this video we're going to talk about all of the key features that they've added, as well as some unique hidden ones that perhaps you haven't heard about as of yet. Now, a few things about this update and the process around it that you should know. Now, the version of firmware I'm going to be talking about is version 3.0 for the a7S III, but yes, they have released new versions for the A1 and the A7 IV, the latter of which isn't particularly interesting. If you're going to do this firmware update on the a7S III, which yes, I would recommend, you should definitely give a thorough look at Sony's documentation on the website around how to perform the update. I will say this is not a particularly intuitive one, at least for a Mac user like myself. You have to install a separate Sony camera driver, which is going to require some extra permissions that you'll need to grant on your Mac, and then following that, install an intermediate update, the version 2.15 firmware, before you install the version 3.0 firmware. One of the big benefits being that going forward, you should be able to update firmware via SD card, like on many of other Sony's cameras, rather than have to deal with this process. But the biggest thing to note with this update is that yes, this is going to wipe any of your custom settings on the camera and effectively make it such that you are starting with a clean slate. So you're definitely going to want to take note of your settings and what they are currently, but for those of you that want to save some time, I have taken my a7S III settings, exported them, and put them on my website that you can download and install in your camera completely free of charge. These settings essentially match what I've already talked through and set up in my A7R5 settings video. They're nearly identical. And yes, I have a separate video on my channel that discusses how to load custom settings, so if you want to save maybe an hour or two and having to go through that yourself, feel free to check that out. Alright, so without further ado, let's talk about what new features we have on the camera. Now, first and foremost, if there is one reason to update to this version of firmware alone, I would say it is for the breathing compensation feature. So in all of Sony's cameras since the a7 IV, this has been a huge asset in being able to reduce any focus breathing, say in some of Sony's prime lenses that tend to exhibit this behavior more, like the 20mm G that I have here, the 50mm GM 1.2, etc. So just for a quick example in the difference that this makes, we have the a7S III and the 20mm G, as I mentioned beforehand, and our little bun friend here. And as you see, as we bring him in and out of frame, we have a lot of focus breathing that we're certainly seeing in terms of the lens and being able to focus on our subject and back to the background. However, if we go into the function menu and set breathing compensation on, and yes, you can add this into the function menu, which is good, what you're going to see is the camera has cropped in slightly, and now when we bring our subject into frame, you should see that the focus and the rack focus on that subject and back to the background is going to look a lot more smooth and certainly not exhibit the focus breathing that we were seeing previously. Again, if there's one reason to move to this firmware update, it is for breathing compensation alone, I would say. But there is a lot more that has also been added here that's worth talking about. And the next thing on that list would be the ability now to shoot in DCI 4K in the XAVC-SI codec, as you can see here. So yes, the ability to shoot in a 17:9 aspect ratio versus conventional UHD in 16:9. But another added benefit you can utilize when shooting in DCI 4K is the ability to shoot true 24 frames per second. So therefore, not 2398 as most of Sony's bodies have had when shooting 24 frames per second, but the more conventional cinema standard of true 24p. However, there is a catch and a caveat to this, mainly being that when you first install this firmware update, you are not going to have DCI 4K or true 24p. At least initially. Now what you're going to have to do is go into Sony's Creators app, log in or create an account, actually download this license, and then install it in the camera. And yes, in fact, once you install it in the camera, you're going to see there is an entirely dedicated setup for licenses that is now present in the a7S III that will allow you to actually see that you've installed this feature. This is a free feature to install, but the fact that Sony is making us go through the Creators app to do it is, let's say, interesting, to say the least. But relatedly, another benefit of this firmware update is actually now the ability to use both the Creators app and the Monitor and Control app with the a7S III. So yes, the Creators app allows for uploading footage to Sony's cloud, doing remote shooting, installing licenses like the one I mentioned for DCI 4K and true 24p, among other things. And the Monitor and Control app actually contains some really nice monitoring features for the camera, essentially allowing you to do a lot of what apps like Monitor Plus does, if you've ever used that one before. So those are definitely going to be worth checking out if you haven't. And yes, if you want DCI 4K and true 24p, you will inevitably end up checking that out. Now, Sony has also added the ability to do timecode via USB to the a7S III using their little device for this. I'll show a picture on screen for that and leave a link to that below if you want to check that out. This is now going to be a more intuitive way of doing timecode with the a7S III that will essentially match what the FX3 can do, so worth checking out if you're interested in that. Now, there are some other features that are on Sony's website, and I'll show that on screen here in terms of what this update contains. Yes, things like FTP transfer functionality, different playback additions and enhancements enhancements they've added, and the usual bug fix improvements that Sony tends to bundle into every firmware update. But I actually want to talk about the more unique things Sony hasn't advertised about this firmware update, and perhaps some other things that no one's really talking about yet. So first and foremost, if you haven't already noticed, this firmware update contains the new video display that most of Sony's newer cameras has. But that's just not the look of the actual display. This includes being able to swipe up and all the different touch gestures for things like the function menu, some of the additional autofocus, and extra features that you can swipe in from the sides. These touch updates are probably most apparent in the video mode, but yes, they are present in the photo mode as well. And beyond that, the main menu overall has gotten a big layout enhancement. Yes, you now have the quick menus that Sony's newer cameras have, and that includes all the different features and the ability to select and monitor and quickly change them on screen when you need to. And so this is a really nice enhancement. I'm not sure why Sony isn't touting or talking about more. The other thing, of course, we have to mention is the fact that autofocus assist now exists in the camera as well. Now, just to demonstrate how this works, as you can see, we are in autofocus. So we do some video inception here, but even in autofocus, I can now use the focus ring on the lens to override autofocus and do some custom manual control here if and as I would like. That's yet another thing I've been setting on cameras like my A7 IV, A7R5, and so this is a really nice thing to have also. But let's go even a little bit deeper to some things you probably haven't heard about yet. Yes, believe it or not, Sony has finally allowed folks to set 1/48 as a shutter speed, or if you wanted something like a 90-degree shutter angle, 1/96. Small thing and not true shutter angle. We're supposed to be getting that later, but this is a nice thing to have, perhaps going along with DCI 4K and true 24p. But the other thing we have to talk about that most people haven't mentioned yet is the fact that if you go into setup option, and then go to anti-dust function, you will see we have the shutter when power off function. This is the ability for the sensor shutter curtain to close when the camera is powered off to protect the sensor. I think cameras since the A1 have had this, but this was never backported to the A7S III until now. And yes, I can confirm it works, so if you're someone that wants to set that, you now have the ability to. Now, I did mention the fact that with the version 3 firmware update, you can now go into managing your licenses on the camera, and you will see, of course, the DCI 4K True 24p one, among potentially others at some point, but you can also display the serial number on the camera if you need to do that. But as to perhaps some minor feature enhancements that I've also noticed with this firmware update, it looks like you can now set the white balance capture frame size, which defaults to large. You'll see if you go into the focus menu, you have the preset focus zoom feature, which, just checking what it does, allows you to register different focus points and zoom positions by long pressing the custom key, and then basically you can register and recall them as you need to. This looks to be on the A9 III, and I actually can't recall if I've seen this on another Sony camera beforehand, so this seems to be a new thing, but let me know if it's not or if I'm missing something there. Also, if you're someone that uses the select finder monitor option, you will see there are now two auto options. One which switches to the viewfinder to suit the angle and direction of the monitor, and the other, which is Auto 2, which basically switches to the viewfinder regardless of the angle and direction of the monitor. And really, Auto 2 is essentially what the more conventional just auto setting was back in Sony's previous cameras. And as to some interesting quirks or maybe even bugs with the new firmware, one thing that is now true is that the peaking display behavior mirrors that of Sony's other newer cameras, where essentially when you have it on, it is on regardless of being in autofocus or manual focus, and when it is off, the same rule applies. In terms of picture profiles, we're basically still flexible ISO only, though it's not essentially called that. We don't have any of the Cine EI modes, and in fact, if we go into PP8, being S-Log3 and S-Gamma3.Cine, one of the things you're going to notice too is that the base ISO is still 640 in this case. Yes, that is the first one, so not 800 as it became in the FX3 when it got its firmware updates, and therefore all the same ISO rules in terms of the base and the dual values still apply. And yes, I do have a separate video on this topic that goes over that you can certainly check out. Now yes, some people have mentioned that this firmware update has disabled the ability to see the battery life percentage when using third-party batteries. I will say I did test this with the SmallRig NP-FC100 equivalent battery, which I have a separate video on this channel on that you can check out, and I will say that this seemed to work fine, so your mileage may vary depending on the third-party battery, but perhaps maybe one of the main reasons to go and consider using the SmallRig option if you're going that route. Now as to what's missing from this firmware update, there's still a decent amount of things. Perhaps the largest is custom LUTs. Yes, if Sony cameras like the A6700 can have this, certainly something like the A7S III can, because we know the FX3 has had it for quite some time as well. There are, of course, other things that those FX cameras have, like anamorphic D-squeeze, the Cine EI modes, as I mentioned before. I can understand some of these things maybe not being backported or becoming maybe optional things, as per that whole license deal with the Creators app. But I really do hope, if nothing else, Sony considers custom LUTs and can start to keep these cameras up to date with different things like shutter angle and other new features as they come out. If nothing else, if there's a parting thought that described my take on this firmware update, it is certainly not everything folks wanted, but it is a step in the right direction. Hopefully Sony can keep all of us that own and use their cameras in mind when releasing future firmware updates for other models and just newer models in general, and can certainly make sure that these cameras don't fall well behind like we know the a7S III did for quite some time. So that's my take on the new a7S III firmware update. Hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. For now, that is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.